Alright, I've been putting off making videos for some time. There's been a lot of shit going on. I will get to some of that later on, maybe. But anyway, I wanted to make a video on the race issues, specifically not responding to any one individual. I'm not doing a ponage video. I'm not doing any kind of... The goal of this video is to hopefully give the more reasonable of the race realists, hereditarians, at least listen to what I have to say and think about it. That's it. I'm not trying to prove you wrong. I'm not trying to invalidate your viewpoints or anything like that. I don't pretend that I'm going to change anybody's mind. But I do want to, provide I want to answer a few specific claims. Again, I'm going to try to avoid addressing specific people, but this again is going to be the group that I am addressing here are those like libertarian realist fringe elements, those who propose fairly reasonable, even though I disagree with them, but fairly reasonable scientific arguments for their definition of race and arguments against the egalitarian viewpoint, if that makes sense. So I'm not, those are the specific people that I'm addressing, the types of videos. And to be perfectly fair, this video is going to go on for a long time. It's probably going to ramble on. It's going to be somewhat disparate. I'm going to cover a wide variety of different topics. Fairly disorganized, unscripted. So if you don't like that kind of video, I don't recommend watching it. But to be perfectly fair again, I did watch a number of several hours worth of videos from the race realist side, and I watched them while taking a few notes here and there, and watching them, listening to what they're saying, not taking a claim and then getting all infuriated over it or anything like that. I tried to listen reasonably and take the argument as it was intended, without any, you're a Nazi or anything like that. Okay, that's and I want to sort of ahead of time let you know when I'm talking in this video. Now, one of the things that's become kind of common in this discussion, and I've noticed, is originally, and I guess us egalitarians sort of started it, was the comparison to creationists. I'm going to try to avoid that. While I still think there's a certain amount of comparison, at least in the arguments, I think that's valid. The race realist groups have responded back, calling the egalitarian position more like creationist, and so in my mind it's become you're more of a creationist. No, you are, and which is meaningless. It's lost its meaning. So I'm going to try to avoid that. If I do bring up creationist arguments, it's not saying you're just like that. I'm bringing up an example of a fallacious argument or a fallacious point made by creationists, and hoping that you can see that comparison, if that makes sense. Okay, again, my brain is really truly elsewhere. Again, my mother is going in for open heart surgery, so I got a lot of other shit going on right now, and this is the last thing in the world I want to do. But I can't, if I don't do it now, it's not, my time allocation is only going to get significantly worse. So sorry for that long introduction. Holy shit, I suck. Anyway, so the first thing I want to do is just define a few terms. Now, I'm not really comfortable with the definition of egalitarian that I've seen thrown about, because I don't know any egalitarians by the definition of the race realists. I don't personally believe that all humans are equal, or I don't believe that all, intelligence is 100% environment and that all humans are equal. I believe that for environmental and genetic reasons, stupid people tend to have stupid kids. Smart people tend to have smart kids. Now, again, there's a whole lot of discussion about what percentages of intelligence is what, and all of our environment versus heredity and all of that. I'm not going to get into that, because to be honest, I could care less. The results are more or less the same. What I don't believe is that there is I don't believe that this IQ reflects race. Okay, if that makes sense. One can imagine a genetic disease, a genetic mutation that has, there's a certain phenotype associated with that mutation, right? That has nothing to do with race. It may happen to be in a black population, it may happen to be in a white population or an Asian population or wherever, or a subset of any of those, okay? It doesn't reflect the race. And that's what I look at with IQ. There are incredibly, phenomenally stupid black people in the world, and Asians and whites, and there are phenomenally intelligent people. And again, those people will tend to have more intelligent children. And that's all. I don't want to, like I said, the heredity of intelligence, I think, is almost, I don't want to say it's a red herring. It seems to me that the argument is going, if you can show that intelligence is hereditary, therefore whites and Asians are superior to black people. And that I don't, and I know that's a gross oversimplification. I don't want to smear one side of this debate with an oversimplification like that. But that's what I get out of it. Okay. Again, and I also believe that there are geographical variations of mankind that are heritable. The reality is a black family living in Anchorage, Alaska, are probably going to have a black child. They're not going to have a native Alaskan child because they live in Alaska, or a white child because they're in temperate climate or Arctic climate, obviously. But again, my point is, what do those really mean in terms of the value, how social policy should indicate, what that means to what you can predict from that on somebody's intelligence, of value to society, and a bunch of other social issues. And I know that people like Rushton have stated specifically that they want to, we don't dictate policy, but I'll get into that a bit more. That's a little bit disingenuous, in my opinion, when you really look at what they say. But anyway, so that's one point. The other point I want to make, and now this is in my field. I'm an invertebrate zoologist, specifically in invertebrate taxonomy, but I have a pretty good background in biology in general, and especially in evolution. I did my master's research in the evolution of sexual characters. So I'm kind of familiar with a lot of that literature. And I'm not saying this makes me something important, but I was a college professor, all right? For many years I was a college professor, and one of the classes I taught was an evolution course called Introduction to Selection Theory. So I'm pretty familiar with that. I wouldn't say I'm a specialist in it. Certain areas I know more than others, and certain areas I'm lacking. And I also taught a course called Introduction to Human Evolution. And it's another area of interest of mine, even though it's very far from my formal training. But I try to keep current on evolutionary biology. And so, with that background, at the very least, I feel like I'm qualified to talk about a few of these issues. And I feel like I'm qualified to address the argument that the egalitarian, as you guys define us, viewpoint is unscientific or just like a creationist. I think that there are some major fallacies being made with that, and I'm going to get into those. But I'm sorry. When people talk about this is what kind of irritates me. And on all sides. This isn't picking on any side of this issue. But when you start using terms like populations and taxonomies and race, depending on where and what context you're using those terms, you're talking about very, very specific things. Okay? If that makes sense. For example, I know there's been some talk that us egalitarians are using population in a something in a different growing or shrinking the definition to fit our needs, to encompass race or not encompass race, and all of this kind of stuff. And I can't disagree with that. I think there have been some misuses of those terms. And so I want to define the terms that when you're talking about taxonomy, you're talking about cladistic, you're talking about the most similar common ancestor. Okay, so when we say a population, we're talking about population in terms of population genetics. All right, we're not talking about population now. Like a social scientist might talk about the population of London, which can be every man, woman, and child of any ethnicity living in London. They might talk about the population of victims of domestic abuse in their subset. They might talk about they may be referring to people of East Asian descent in a particular group they're studying. So the definition can have pretty different meanings, and usually it's very well defined. But that's not a taxonomic definition. Okay, and so when we say race is a social construct, as it is, that's because in taxonomically at least, race gets to be fairly meaningless because of the fact that I don't want to go into the painful details of taxonomy, but when you start looking at something like least common ancestor, right? Okay, so Europeans and Asians have a more similar common ancestor than do the the people living in Africa, sub-Saharan Africans, as they're so often defined. That's true. So we should share more genetic in common with Asians, and Europeans should have more in common than they do with sub-Saharan Africans. That's true. So then, therefore, does that make Africans a race, black a race, versus Asians versus Caucasians? The problem with that is that we share, and I have a bunch of papers. I'll put some links down below. Caucasians and Asians share a least common ancestor with East Africans as opposed to the other African groups. Now, what does that mean? We share significant amount. I mean, essentially, the population that left Africa that we now know as Caucasians and Asians are closer to some Africans than those Africans are to other Africans. You see what I mean? So therefore, to look at an African from Kenya and an African from the Congo or South Africa and say they belong to the same race becomes pretty meaningless. They might look the same. They have same skin tones or similar skin tones. They might have similar hair textures and those kinds of things. But if you're going to start looking at quantifiable differences in personality traits or intelligences or other features, you got to look at it. If you're going to claim genetics, if you're going to claim a taxonomy, you have to have resolved how that tree fits together. Hopefully that made some sense. One example of this that comes to mind is there's a paper by Eli et al. 2006 on mitochondrial haplotypes of African Americans. And what these authors looked at is they compared a group, I believe the sample was 58, maybe I might be wrong on that, I'm going from memory here, African Americans, and then looked at their haplotype groupings to determine where their African ancestry, what portions of Africa they were from. And found the results were pretty surprising. When you combine the regions, because they found, I believe it was 4 different regions, but the point being all in West Africa, West Central, and West, I think two in Southwest. Anyway, the point being that's doing 96% of African Americans trace their ancestry to Western Africa, with virtually no representatives from East Africa, strict South Africa, for example, or North Africa. Now, this is really kind of what's the importance of this? If you're going to talk about American black people as a race, you're going to say, here they represent a race in a taxonomic sense. What does that tell us when you're looking for characteristics of that? And well, can you look at any characteristic of an African American and then make a statement about Africans. Hopefully that makes sense. When African Americans are really all derived from a subset. So if there are genetic differences in intelligence or behavior, and I don't believe that those exist, being a dipshit egalitarian as I am, but if those exist, all you're saying is that then they may have existed in the ancestors from one fairly narrow band in Western Africa, if that makes sense. You cannot use that then to look at the rest of Africa. Okay, now back to populations again. Now there was a video, I think it was Libertarian Realist showed, where there was somebody talking about race and using the term populations, and I can't argue that the person was using the term very in a slippery sense, kind of going back and forth between a more social view of population and a taxonomic view of population, and certainly the equivocation, I believe is the word. But I want to talk about population as it relates to population genetics, right? Okay, when you're looking at population genetics, there's a fairly specific, now it's not an absolute, but it's a fairly specific definition, which is that a population is defined as a group within a species where gene flow does not occur between that and another population more frequently than approximately once every 50 generations. Okay? Now, that's not that 50 generations, that's going to vary depending on the life history of the species and things like that. There's a lot of factors that are going to come into play with that. But overall, a quick and dirty, as we say, definition is once every 50 generations. And, that kind of holds fairly true. So when you look at, two bird populations, you can look at, pick a particular allele and look at whether or not gene flow between one population and another population occurs more frequently than once every 50 generations. If it does, then they're a single population, even though they may be subpopulations. There may be, they may have definite regional variations, if that makes sense. Those regional variations can still persist, even though there are alleles, especially alleles that are positively or negatively selected between the two. I know that's over wordy, I apologize. But by that definition, there are no human populations. We are a single population. Humanity has interbred, genes flow freely between all groups. Now, there are a number of subgroups of humans where gene flow has been restricted, strongly restricted. But the evidence seems to be pointing at that gene flow still has occurred, and at a level frequent enough to prevent those from becoming their own populations. I believe that prior to European expansion, there are some groups that we'd call it incipient populations. There were groups that were well on their way to being distinct populations, but historical contingency that didn't happen. All right, and that's going to be really important in a little bit. I'm going to get to that probably in the next video. I just want to get through these definition things here first. So human beings, and the way that this works is that it doesn't mean that an individual in the center of one subpopulation necessarily has to physically cross with a member from the center of another subpopulation or subgroup, right? This means that an allele spreads from one to the sort of a ring, think of it, a ring around it, and then those individuals will spread to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, stepwise until genes can flow. There's one, God, I wish I could remember what the allele was, but it is thought to have evolved in Northern Europe, and it's been found in Pacific Islanders, meaning that in basically less than 2,000 years, a particular allele, just through drift, spread to the other side of the planet, essentially, which is pretty amazing. But that kind of thing happens, and that's really important when we're looking at human groups. And again, it doesn't in any way invalidate the hereditary hypothesis, if you want to call it that. It doesn't. It doesn't mean that there can't be, simply because an allele can spread doesn't mean that it did, and all of these kinds of factors. It doesn't mean that if intelligence was centralized in one group or another group, it doesn't have to have spread to other groups. Okay, so I'm not saying that. I just want to make this kind of clear while making it really murky. Ugh. See, I suck. I warned you ahead of time. Okay. All right, time to shift gears here a little bit, and I'm going to talk about bias now. And this is again really important. And this kind of goes back to the whole comparison with creationism and stuff like that. And I don't want to, again, I'm not throwing out an accusation about this, but if I use a creationism example, it's not saying you guys are just like creationists. I'm saying the arguments, there are some similarities. Okay, so again, I'm not using it as a argumentum ad creationism or something like that. All right. But biases. Now that's really important because now everybody is biased. I think that is really needs to be said. Everybody's biased. I am absolutely biased as an egalitarian dipshit, or I'm biased. I will freely admit that I'm biased, and what that means in real terms, for me, is that if I am reading a paper on, I'll say, a IQ study of Nigerian school children compared to a adjacent group of white students in Nigeria, and I find that the scores are equal, their IQ scores come out to be statistically insignificantly different. I mean, not significantly different. Right? I read that paper. My tendency is going to be to look at those results and go, yeah, see, I knew I was right because of my bias. And I'll freely admit that. But what becomes important about it is knowing that I have that bias. I need to then consciously make an effort to look at if there's been rebuttals to that study. I need to read the methods, the statistics used in that study. I need to look at it just as critically as I would a study that showed a glaring difference in IQ scores, right? If I see a paper with huge differences in IQ scores, my first impression, my gut reaction is crap study, right? And yet the two studies reaching completely opposite results may be equally, they both may be completely based on biased samples, bad stats, a whole bunch of other factors, right? They could both be studies that are completely full of shit. And yet my reaction to the first would be to not be as critical of it. And I need to consciously make sure that I am as critical of it. That's part of being something of a rational human being, right? And in the hereditarian view, and this, I'm not, again, I know you guys are not all one viewpoint, okay? I recognize that there's a wide variety, a whole spectrum of different ideas. And so I'm not picking on any individual in this or anything like that. I'm talking about as a, general, a hereditarian view. How about that? Seems to imply to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that they view the egalitarian viewpoint as being entirely based on what we want to be true, on a touchy-feely, PC gone mad view of the world, that everybody's equal and everything's good, and that with that in mind, we ignore all facts contrary to our opinion. We refuse to read or accept sources that disagree with us and only endorse sources that agree with us. And contrary to that the hereditarian view, the race realist view, is purely based, no biases whatsoever, is based only on what the science says, and that they approached the issue completely open-minded and objective, and just simply followed the data to its logical conclusion. And I that's an issue. Well, I have a big problem with that because it's not really true. And I've actually heard Rushton make that claim pretty close to almost word for word what I made, in the sense that stating that he's simply a scientist and had no biases when he approached this area of study, and was merely he's just merely being honest while everybody else is being dishonest. And I want to get to just a couple examples. And again, I'm not going to be picking on anybody. But, okay, now I'm going to revert to the creationism thing. I'm not, again, calling anybody that. I want to make that really clear, okay? I'm going to... I think that we should all stop doing that, as satisfying as it might be at times. But if any of you have ever had the pleasure of discussing, say, human evolution with a creationist, and one of the things that you'll very often hear is this, well, Oxnard proved that Lucy was just a monkey. That's a really common thing. And when you hear somebody say that, right, now, in that the person using that argument, making that claim, typically they're not familiar with Oxnard, right? What they are doing is they're repeating what they heard another creationist claim. They are highly unlikely, if ever, in fact I've yet to encounter any, that actually have read the Sex, Teeth, and Bones, where that comes from. And because the claim's not even in that book whatsoever, he merely makes the claim that the Australopithecines were somewhat divergent from the main human line of evolution. That's what the claim that he makes. Other creationists have taken that claim, extrapolated it far beyond what Oxnard actually said, and summarized it as Oxnard said Australopithecines were just apes, and then that's then repeated as Lucy was just a monkey, right? Okay, and hopefully everybody's familiar with that and has encountered that. But when somebody makes that claim, you can immediately tell that they're operating from a position of bias, right? Does that make sense? Because obviously they didn't consult the source. Even if they did read Oxnard's Sex, Teeth, and Bones, they didn't read any follow-up studies, right? They didn't read any of the rebuttals to it. They didn't read what Oxnard said later on when he reevaluated his position on Australopithecines. They're completely unaware of further studies. What they did because of the bias, and again, we're all subject to this. I'm not claiming innocence on this at all. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm assuming that other egalitarians would say the same thing. You find a source that supports your position, and there's a tendency to want to sort of stick to that source. Okay, kind of look at it as this is the final argument. This was the end of that debate. Done. Let's go on to the next point. When it may not be the end of the debate. The debate may be ongoing. The viewpoint may have been long refuted. But when you keep bringing it up, you expose your bias. And I'm going to provide a specific example. And again, I want to make it clear I'm not picking on anybody here on this. But I've seen, I think, 2 or 3 videos by Libertarian Realist where he made the claim, stated it as a fact, that the Microcephalin D allele in Europeans and Asians, not present in sub-Saharan Africans, was derived from Neanderthals. And stated that as here's this fact that is contrary to the egalitarian position, right? And if I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. I know it's oversimplified, but at the same time, I think that's basics of what your viewpoint on that was. And but when you look at where that comes from, look at the source of that, which is Evans et al. 2005 and Evans et al. 2006, where they looked at Microcephalin D, and you find that it differs a little bit. There's a couple of different, and I'm going to explain this. This is just as an example, okay? Don't take this up. This isn't an attack. But what they found is that Microcephalin D the allele was more prevalent in Northern Europeans and in in people of Asian descent, while fairly less prevalent in Africa, especially in some subpopulations. Oop, I almost used the P word. Subpopulations like the San in Africa had as little as 3% of their individuals carried the microcephalin D. 3% of the San have the microcephalin D, right? So it's not absent in Africa, it's just less frequent. And that's in the original papers. But then in that same paper, remember this is 2006. This was a long time ago, and given the pace of genetics, that was a generation ago in genetics thought. The authors proposed that the high frequency of this allele in Europeans and Asians could be due to hybridization with Neanderthals. Right? They hypothesized that they made a prediction based on this to explain what we see now. A storyline to say, okay, let's just say Neanderthals had crossed and they had this microcephalin D, the results would look a lot like what we see today, so we're making that prediction as a test of our hypothesis, right? That's how science progresses. It's a very logical thing to do. But Green et al., 2010, the Neanderthal genome that the study that showed that Neanderthals did indeed hybridize with modern humans, right? There you go. There's your... So finally, 5 years after Evans et al. Made this prediction, finally we could test their prediction. And what was the result? Well, the result was that Neanderthals did hybridize with people leaving Africa, right? But you know what? Microcephalin D, the allele, wasn't found in Neanderthals. They didn't have it. At least based on the 5 genome samples of Neanderthal we have, it's not present. Therefore, the prediction of Evans et al. Failed. Microcephalin D wasn't due to that. But the fact that it's now stated as if this is a given shows me, just like the Lucy is just a monkey, shows me that you probably didn't read the original article. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but it doesn't seem to be the case because, again, you would have seen that this microcephalin D is found in sub-Saharan African populations. It's just less frequent, significantly less frequent, but it's there. But then you also never looked at any follow-ups to it. You took that. It fit your model, it fit your prediction, it fit what you wanted to be true, and you stopped looking at papers there. That's an example of this confirmation bias. And again, we all have that bias. I'm not saying you're wrong for having the bias, but it's a matter of knowing that you have that bias, following up on it, and looking into more, looking at what other things state. All right, I'm going to end this now. I know this has gone on way too long. I'm over 30 minutes, and that's I know it's painful to watch me at my best of times.